This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I am delighted that Professor Danny Orbach has joined me from Jerusalem today. Dr. Orbach has many credentials, including his work on various aspects of history. He works at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's written many books on military history, political assassinations and coups, military adventurism, illegal orders, and many other things. But at the moment, what we're going to focus with Dr. Orbach in this interview is a report that he led in recent weeks on trying to understand whether using international frameworks, whether the violence that's happening in the war in Gaza can actually be called a genocide or not. This is a very critical issue. In recent weeks, the G word, so to speak, the genocide word, has filled global newspapers, television channels, and others. Dr. Orbach's work gives a counter narrative to this using extremely data-driven processes. I should add that Dr. Orbach has indeed criticized some aspects of the Israeli government's moves or work in the Gaza Strip, or its counter actions against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But his work gives a broader framework for us to understand whether the genocide word, which is a really technical word, can be used for this violence. Dr. Orbach, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to begin straight out, Dr. Orbach, on this question. At a time when this genocide word is being used everywhere about this military action in Gaza, including in the United Nations, in various newspapers, and so on and so forth, your very extensive, detailed study pushes back. It gives a counter argument using very hard data. Could you walk us through your argument for our audience?
Sure. What we try to do in our report is not to have a legal discussion, because we think that shouldn't happen at the first stage, because any legal or ethical discussion should be based on facts. Think about it as a multi-storied building. The first floor has to be factual analysis. We have to know what happened. Only when we know what actually happened, we could have the second floor of legal analysis and the third floor, which is ethical analysis, to discuss what's moral and what's not moral, what's right and what's wrong. But before we discuss law, before we discuss ethics, before we discuss morality, we need to know what happened. And for that reason, we don't even begin with the definition of genocide, trying to see if Israel fit or doesn't fit the definition. We try to see what happened regarding starvation, massacres, and indiscriminate bombings. Because genocide is trying to exterminate a group, right? In war, the means to do so is usually to starve the group, to deliberately perpetrate mass killings, either frontal, face-to-face, or through bombings. Usually genocides have all three elements, by the way. And what we try to show, that the genocide allegations fail even on this basic level. Because when you check whether Israel starved the Gazan population or massacred the Gazan population or bombed the Gazan population indiscriminately, the answer is no on all three counts. And I'll explain in a second. So it's not only that we can debate whether the definition of genocide is ill-fitting or fitting, is that Israel didn't even come close to this gray zone area where you can actually start discussing genocide. Because in order to start discussing genocide, in my opinion, first of all, you have to prove that the perpetrating state tried to maximize civilian casualties. Doesn't have to destroy the entire group, because in most genocides, the entire group is actually not destroyed. But at least they need to attempt to do so. And the first stage is to at least be completely indifferent about mass deaths of civilians or trying to deliberately cause the mass deaths of civilians. But even if we prove that the perpetrating state tried to maximize deaths of civilians, still doesn't prove it's a genocide. It could be a very cruel war. But what I'm saying, for example, the Allies in the Second World War tried to kill as many German and Japanese civilians as they could, and it was still not a genocide. It was a very cruel war, but it was not a genocide. Maximizing civilian casualties, it's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition. But if even this necessary condition is not there, and as we showed, the Israeli army was maybe the most restrained army in military history facing such conditions, we cannot even start to speak about genocide. The factual basis is simply not there.
May I put this to you that a lot of people say today that this war has gone on for too long. Now, of course, we're speaking at a very critical juncture, Dr. Orbach. On one hand, some semblance of a ceasefire seems to getting thrashed out with the help of the American administration. Now, the exact contours of that will become apparent to us in coming weeks and months. At the same time, there has been this terrible, tragic attack in the UK on a synagogue. This, of course, follows many other attacks, including in America and other places, and which has contributed to a very sort of renewed, terrible climate of anti-Semitic violence. So therefore, we are talking at a very interesting and a very critical juncture. I want to ask you, some people may say that you are really clutching at threads, Dr. Orbach. Why is this so important at the moment to understand? Why is this so critical when there are obviously larger issues at play, when the hostages that Hamas holds has not been returned, tragically, when, of course, in some senses, the military operation continues, and in a sense, this conversation has reached a crescendo of some sorts around the world. What would you say to people who would say, well, should we really be talking about these definitions at this juncture? Do they even matter?
You know, as a scientist, I'm always tempted to say the truth matters for its own sake. First of all, we need to know what happened. And I always tell people who ask me this question, okay, do you want to know the truth or do you want to live in a lie? And sometimes people can live in lies for many years because there is a certain version that becomes accepted in the media. In our study, we give the example of the sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, where you can still read in many books that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died out of malnutrition due to the sanctions. And now we have the census of the Iraqi government, and we know it was a complete invention. Never happened. And still, when people started to bring the contradictory evidence, see, it's not the case. In the same UN survey where they spoke about mass malnutrition of children, they spoke about an epidemic of obesity in Iraq. How does it sit together? But whenever people started to ask questions, they got this response. Why does it matter? Children are dying, and you are counting calories? But the notion that children are dying is dependent on the mistaken belief, right? So see this kind of circular way of thinking. But I would like to actually give an even deeper answer. One of the problems in the genocide narrative, and I think in the anti-Israeli discourse in this war more broadly, is that it views this war unilaterally. Read and I challenge our listeners and I challenge our audience. Open 10 random anti-Israeli reports, UN reports, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights. I give only several examples. And what you'll see is that Israel is playing alone on the field. Israel is destroying, Israel is killing, Israel is doing this, Israel is bombing, Israel is doing that. But Hamas never exists. The war is presented as a unilateral show. And that's the only way you could reach this mistaken myth of genocide, when you just actually ignore that there is a war. Tomer Bartov wrote actually, no, this is not a war. This is a unilateral massacre. If we open the report of Physicians for Human Rights, for example, and use the search function, you'll see the word Israel 290 times and the word Hamas 29 times only. Usually, Hamas is mentioned in the context of October 7th. Most reports condemn October 7th, not always, but usually, and then completely ignore Hamas and speak about what Israel did in Gaza, as if Hamas stopped to exist on October 8th. But war, and that's what we try to show in our report, is a reciprocal activity. A reciprocal and interactive activity, also a competitive activity. War has two sides, sometimes more, and you cannot understand what one side is doing without taking into account what the other side is doing, because a strategy of a belligerent is always trying to cope with the strategy of his enemy. And of course, our listeners are well familiar with the conflict between India and Pakistan in Kashmir. No one will think of analyzing Indian strategy without trying to understand what Pakistan is actually doing in Kashmir, right? It's ridiculous. But that's exactly what people are doing in the Gaza war. I'll give you an example. People speak about the killing, the death of civilians, of many civilians, and the destruction of hospitals in Gaza. But they completely ignore the fact that Hamas has a very vicious human shield strategy, where it's shooting and hiding within hospitals and clinics and schools and kindergartens, digging 500 kilometers of tunnels under civilian places. They ignore the fact that Hamas fighters almost always use civilian clothes, masquerading as civilians, picking up weapons from small caches and trying to shoot at close range. So when you try to understand why did Israel destroy this hospital? Why did Israel shoot the civilian who got too close to the troops? To cope with this human shields Hamas strategy. And now I get into your question on why it's important. Because this unilateral view of war, that Israel exists alone and Hamas is not taken into account, is actually incentivizing terror organizations like Hamas to double down on such human shield strategy. Because if you are hiding in hospitals, you get a military advantage, and then your enemy is being accused of destroying the hospitals, then all terrorist organizations around the world will learn the lesson. Next time, we are going to hide in hospitals. So not dealing with this problem now will make the Hamas example being imitated by terrorist organizations all around the world. That's the reason our report is important. That's the reason it's important to speak about this subject now.
I want to drill down into your report at the moment, Dr. Orbach, and I want to talk about a very important and an interesting section of your report, which talks about what kind of food supplies went into Gaza at what point, and tackles very, sure-footedly, I would say, this issue of whether there was starvation or not, and what caused, even if there were certain periods where there was a lack of food, what actually caused that lack of food, who was responsible, and so on and so forth. Could you walk us, because this idea of prevention of food supplies to the civilian population is one of the cornerstones of this entire, this genocide narrative. But your report explicitly details on how this is actually a false impression. The data does not support this. Could you walk us through this entire issue of food supplies?
Sure. First of all, I want to begin with the correct framing. Israel's critics accuse it of not giving enough food and not giving enough maybe nutrition or variety of foods. But before we deal with these accusations head on, we have to ask ourselves how many belligerents throughout history gave food in large extents to enemy-controlled territory. Do you have a guess what the number is?
No.
One, only Israel. There is no other power that I know of in history that supplied food to enemy-controlled territory. Actually, one of the problems in wartime is that sometimes belligerents don't even supply food to their own territory. And our Indian listeners know well the famine in Bengal, where the British Empire didn't supply Bengal with enough food, though Bengal was under British control. So let alone enemy-controlled territories. Nobody even thought about supplying Germany and Japan with food. Actually, the Allied operation of to besiege Japan in 1943 was called Operation Starvation. So they were quite explicit about it. So I think we'll agree it's quite ridiculous to accuse of genocide the only power that actually fed its enemy to such a large extent during wartime. So that's our discussion should begin from this point. Why? Because we as Israeli scholars are very frustrated that whenever Israel is walking an extra mile, taking on itself humanitarian obligations well beyond state custom and what's common in international law, then the goalpost moves further. This becomes the new standard, and we are being accused of not doing more. So this is a perverse incentive because it gives you an incentive to do as least as you can, humanitarianly speaking. So now what we show in our report, that not only Israel fed Gaza during the war, Israel actually gave more food to Gaza than it gave before the war, for most of the war. The UN told erroneously that before the war, 500 daily trucks came into Gaza, out of which 150 or 180 trucks were food trucks. This is not true. The real number was 73. And during the war, the average was more than 100. Of course, you need to take into account the destruction of local productions, 12% of calorie consumption. This is something like 10 trucks, 10 additional trucks. In any case, Israel overfed Gaza during the war. Doesn't mean that there was no malnutrition or, pockets of food insecurity, because there is war and there is chaos and there is dislocation all the time, and Hamas is looting the aid and other gangs are looting the aid, and there are bad roads, trucks are being stuck, you have to coordinate truck movement with active fighting. There are problems of food supply. But again, this is war. We are feeding our enemies, while our enemies can end this war and the food insecurity when it exists in one moment, accept the conditions of Israel to end the war. Hamas should disarm, the Hamas leadership should leave Gaza, and a new regime unconnected to Hamas should be established. And it's again this unilateral view of war that I criticized in answer to your previous question. People speak about how much food Israel gives Gaza as if Hamas doesn't have an agency here. Agree to one of the ceasefire agreements and get all the food that you want. And still, even though Israel gave enormous amounts of food, 2 million tons during the war to the Gaza Strip, I must add that there were 2 months, from March to May 2025, where Israel stopped food aid completely, didn't stop water, though, because they wanted to create a new system where Hamas cannot loot the aid. That was the idea. The international norm, by the way, when you look at other conflicts, usually warlords who are controlling a contested territory are looting around 70% or more of the aid which is coming in. This is actually very usual. So Israel was mistaken to believe that there is enough food in the Gaza Strip and we could put a restart to the system and replan a new system of food supply. There started to be acute food insecurity in Gaza during July, and Israel fixed it, just pumped in enormous amounts of food, actually sacrificing its own military operations. For a long time, it declared humanitarian pauses of 10 hours per day, every day, just in order for more food to get in. So I would summarize. Not only that Israel did not starve Gaza, Israel fed Gaza like nobody fed its enemy during wartime.
I also want to talk about something you alluded to just a little while ago in the conversation, Dr. Orbach, which is, and I think this is not spoken of enough, right? I mean, and I really want to understand this better from you. We all know, and this is well known, though again, as I said, it's not discussed enough, that Hamas consistently uses this terrible, devastating policy of using human shields, civilian populations behind whom, under hospitals, arms and ammunitions are kept, particularly vulnerable sections of the population are put forward behind which, Hamas operates. Now, the problem there, at least according to an outsider like me, is that it's impossible not to believe, Dr. Orbach, that at least some of these civilian population, at least some, are actually complicit in being used as human shields. And I wonder what you think about this, because at the end of the day, of course, a lot of it would be coerced, a lot of it would be, under duress, under pressure, perhaps of, fear of death and so on and so forth. But certainly, there could be some civilian populations who are acquiescing, in a sense, to being used in this manner, which makes the
And then
situation
they
even more deadly.
and then they lose their protection under international law, of course. And we know, unfortunately, that there was enormous support in Gaza to Hamas. Most people in the international media still portray Gaza as Hamas as, unconnected entities. As Hamas are kind of aliens from outer space who took control of an unwilling population. I was a historian of Nazi Germany for many years, and it always reminds me of some apologetic Germans who tried to say after 1945 that Germany was an occupied country, occupied by the Nazis, I mean. And of course, it's not true because the Nazi regime sprang from within Germany. It was a German political force, just like Hamas is a Gazan political force. And I would like to say that when the war began, we didn't see even one anti-Hamas protest in Gaza. We didn't see even one person who condemned the terrible rapes, mutilations, and murders that happened in Israel, but we did see jubilations, mass celebrations in Gaza, and by the way, in the West Bank and among the Palestinian diaspora in the West. We also saw Gazan mobs lynching poor girls, Israeli hostages in the street of Gaza. If you look for Shani Lok, you'll read the story. And the abductees, our hostages, usually didn't encounter even one person who treated them humanely. Doesn't mean that there were no such people in Gaza, but it means that we were, at the best, very, very rare. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, I do not share with extreme Israeli views that there are no innocents in Gaza, because I separate very strictly between moral responsibility, which I think that Gaza said, and criminal culpability. So the fact that a person behaved in a morally abhorrent way cannot mean he or she should be killed in war. These are completely two different questions. So having said that, when we see that Hamas had so much support, and Hamas is actually based on family networks in Gaza, we see that, of course, it had a very strong core of supporters. I would say around 35% of the population. By the way, very similar to Nazi Germany, which are not, soft supporters or fellow travelers, but the real fanatic core of the movement. And many of these people did volunteer to serve as human shields. In previous campaigns in Gaza, there were actually people who just said it or boasted of it. But again, and this is very important, Hamas is incentivized by the international community to use human shields. Because when they are not really criticized for doing it, and Israel is criticized when it is shooting the hospitals that Hamas is using, then I would say Hamas will do it even more, and the next other terrorist organizations throughout the world will imitate it. I'll end my response by saying, or quoting the international legal scholar Jeffrey Korn, who wrote that actually human shields is not an appropriate term for what Hamas is using. It's much worse than human shields. And I'll explain. Human shields, usually means that you are indifferent to the lives of the civilians involved. You are packing civilians inside military installations in hope that the enemy will spare these military installations in order not to hurt civilians. And this is what Saddam Hussein, for example, did in the various wars in Iraq. What Hamas is doing is much worse. Quran writes that Hamas is putting civilians in harm's way deliberately because they know that when civilians are killed, it's bad for Israel. And they know that Israel doesn't want to shoot civilians, so soldiers will hesitate before they shoot somebody who gets close to them, and that may give the terrorist one more second to draw a gun or to put an ID. And this again incentivizes terrorist organizations to use human shield strategy. The international community is being anti-humanitarian here in a way because they don't think about unintended results. This is a really, really crucial point that one has to emphasize again and again and again.
We come towards the end of this conversation, Dr. Orbach. I want to put to you that this genocide word has obviously really spread, and also as more and more countries try to stop this conflict from growing further, certain countries are, in a sense, recognizing the Palestinian state. Obviously, there is no Palestinian state on the ground, so what that recognition actually means on the ground is unclear at best and ambiguous. How do you see this process move forward now? I mean, are you hopeful that this ceasefire deal that is being negotiated will, in a sense, bring home the hostages, will create some sort of, framework for going forward? Are you hopeful that there would be some sort of transnational entity that would govern the region for some time, the Gaza region for some time? How do you see this pan out going forward?
I, of course, support the Trump plan. I think it's a good one. At least the best in the current circumstances. I don't think that Hamas will agree to the plan out of its own will because as far as we are concerned, we are ready to sacrifice the entire Gaza for their hallucinations and messianic visions. It will work only if even the allies of Hamas in the Arab and Muslim world will pressure them to accept the deal. And it seems that it is happening now, that Qatar and Turkey are doing just that, and even Pakistan. But what I'm afraid of is that Hamas will begin a new lying campaign of starvation or massacre or something similar. Everyone will forget pressuring Hamas to accept the deal, and then the war will go on and more people will die. This is my greatest fear. Now, the game is to pressure Hamas to accept the deal without changes, without yes, but. Because what we are always doing is, accepting in principle and then adding so many conditions that kind of draw us all the meaning from the plan.
Dr. Danny Orbach, thank you very much. No doubt we'll have an opportunity to talk to you again as this terrible situation evolves and hopefully evolves towards a ceasefire of some sorts. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to discuss all of these ramifications as we go along. But for today, thanks very much for your time. Indeed, as this video goes online, we will share the link to Dr. Orbach's report also as part of the body text of this report for all those who are interested. Thanks very much for your time, Dr. Orbach.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.